Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi. My name is Peter Jones. I'm a professor here at the university, and I'll be very brief. My job is essentially to introduce the introducer. We're here to honor Michael Bell. This is the second annual lecture in his memory, and there's no one better qualified, I think, to introduce him than Mike Malloy, who served with him for many years, worked with him for many years after retirement. And he will say a few words about Michael and then introduce our distinguished speaker. So thank you very much. Mike?
Well, good afternoon. Maybe stand closer to the mic, Mike. Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Mr. Clark, we're very honored to have you here and to see so many friends of Michael's and veterans of the Middle East wars in one way or another. It's a topic that's very much on all of our minds these days. Just a word or two about Michael. I don't know if most of you know how I encountered him. I was in Jordan, and Mr. Clark had made the decision to shut the embassy in Beirut down. And a stun crew from Beirut arrived and moved in with us. And so we had the terrible situation of having two ambassadors under the same roof. We thought there might be a nuclear explosion by the time it was through. But anyway, the big question was, having made the decision to close the Beirut because of the couple of very bad near misses, what did we do next, especially at the beginning of the summer when the Lebanese war was on and everybody who had a military-age son was trying to get them to go on a holiday in Canada. And so they were lined up 10 deep wherever you wanted to go. So the morning after the refugees arrived, my colleague from the immigration department in Beirut, Scott Mullen, and I sat down over lunch with my last bottle of Geneva wine and a couple of steaks, and decided, we need to send something that cuts through the political stuff and just says, we've got this big mountain of people wanting to get to Canada now. They need visas. So what do we do? So we crafted a very technical message. It came from me, not from the ambassadors. It was just immigration business, nothing political at all about opening an embassy in Syria, and said, you can do it anywhere you want as long as it's Syria. And here's why you can't do it in Israel, and here's why you can't do it in Cyprus, here's why you can't do it in Turkey and Egypt and Iraq and all the other countries. It's got to be Damascus. So it took some effort to get it past the two ambassadors, as you can imagine, the cross winds that were blowing there. But the very next morning, the phone rings just as I get into work, and I pick up the phone and this is Michael Bell. I have been instructed to tell you that the message you sent yesterday was singularly helpful. Click. And I thought, I wonder what kind of a relationship I'm going to have with this man. But as it was the beginning of long, fruitful, sometimes very tempestuous, but always, always interesting, sometimes hilarious. And at one stage, and after retirement, as we were working on a very complicated project in Jerusalem, General John Jastastelin, who had come in to our team, said, I've never met people who take their work so seriously and themselves so unseriously in my life. And I think that was Michael. He's been gone for a little over a year now, and I still catch myself thinking when something shows up on the news, or I hear something on the radio, or see something, I wonder what Michael will say about, and then I stop. So that's a sign of somebody whose life has become very intertwined with your own. And I think for most of us who had the pleasure and honor of working with him over the years, it's probably a common feeling. Now, I would like to now introduce our guest speaker, Ambassador Daniel C. Kurtzer, who is the S. Daniel Abram Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Michael, myself, and John Bell all met Dan Kurtzer when the Americans asked us very politely, if we would take on the refugee file in the multilateral peace process that was started right after the big Madrid conference. It was the biggest American effort to get an agreement, a peace agreement. And he was, and we weren't told much. It's just, you're going to do a refugee working group, and we had to kind of invent it as we went along. And whenever we came to a point where we didn't know what to do next, we could pick up the phone, and there'd be this friendly voice at the other end, and we'd explain what we were thinking, and he would give us good, sound advice. And that was the way our whole relationship was with Dan, which went on for many, many years. Dan's career included time as a political officer at the American embassies in Cairo and Tel Aviv. He was also deputy director of the Office of Egyptian Affairs, a speechwriter for the policy planning staff, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. But more to the point, in the years where Michael was Canadian ambassador to Cairo, Dan was American ambassador to Cairo. And in the Michael's second term as ambassador in Tel Aviv, Dan was there. That's a very rare thing in a diplomatic career, to actually see that kind of overlap. And it resulted, I think, in a very unusual and quite profound friendship between the two men. And I can't think of anyone at all who's better positioned to honor Michael's memory by giving a talk on. And I'm delighted to say that the title of his talk is Trump and the Middle East, Trump's policy in the Middle East, tweet and retreat. So with no further ado, may I introduce Dan.
It's a great privilege to be here today, and I don't say that in the normal way that you say you're privileged to be somewhere. When the invitation came from Mike and Peter Jones to deliver this second lecture in memory of Michael Bell, I think my reply preceded the incoming message. That's how quickly I was happy to accept. First of all, it's an opportunity to see them. It's a particular opportunity to see Linda, who remains a very close friend of my wife Sheila and me. It's a surprise to see John Bell and a happy occasion. And it's an honor that, Mr. Clark, you've joined us today. Thank you so much. There's a fellow in Israel who served as a Supreme Court Justice, Eliakim Rubinstein, who used to say before he would deliver a public address, before I speak, let me say a few words. And I do want to start today by talking a little bit about Michael. You heard a little bit from Mike Malloy about our relationship, and it is, I would not exaggerate by saying, unique for two diplomats from different countries to have such parallel lives and intersecting lives. As you heard, we met first in the 1990s when the multilateral negotiations were underway after the Madrid Peace Conference. And the team that Canada assembled to run the Refugee Working Group was incredibly talented. This was, in fact, one of the most difficult working groups that we had put together. Deals with one of the core issues in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there was no better choice of a country to lead that effort than Canada. And as it turns out, Canada made the best choice of the people that it assigned to do so. And Michael was among those, together with John and Mike and others. And so getting to know them then, spending some time with them in, what's the name of the place we were at? Montebello, in the midst of one of the worst snowstorms, I imagine. The Canadian Mounties gave us these very heavy snowsuits just to keep us warm. But trying to work on these challenging issues with these professionals, which actually was interesting because they were to become friends as well. And then to show up in Cairo as the American ambassador, and there's Michael Bell. And then to show up in Tel Aviv as the American ambassador, and there's Michael Bell again. And then afterwards, when Michael and his team developed ideas for resolving the Jerusalem issue, the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, to be invited to join that team and to help develop very interesting and far-reaching ideas for dealing with the Jerusalem issue. There are stories that I won't tell because Linda still has to live in this community about where we spent one Canada Day together. But I'll leave it at that. Those of you who know Linda can ask her about it. But I just can tell you that when I read that the Globe and Mail called Michael the face of Canadian diplomacy in the Middle East, it was a perfect description of a man that I was privileged to call a friend, and also was privileged to know as a tremendous diplomat. And as with so many of you in the room today, I miss him a great deal. But also am fortunate, as is Sheila, that Linda remains our close friend and my host here in Ottawa. You heard the title of the talk. It comes from an op-ed that I wrote for the New York Daily News, which tried to describe the foreign policy generally of Donald Trump as tweet and retreat. In other words, a president who sends out a daily barrage of what are increasingly mindless rants, invective and venting, filled with, unfortunately, lies, personal insults, awful language, racist and misogynist attitudes. You can see I'm not a supporter of my president. And I'm sorry to say that because I had always believed before this president that you kept your political debates and disputes within the boundaries of your own country. But this is a difficult time, and particularly here in Canada, where the president has insulted Canadians and insulted your leadership. I really don't want to hold back in explaining to you my own views on this subject. So this is a president who does this in these daily tweets, and increasingly it's clear that they don't mean anything. You know, we read in some of the books that have been published that, in fact, aides in the White House have taken to removing documents and other kinds of papers from his desk. And he doesn't even know that they're being removed because, in a sense, the policy doesn't matter. It's the pronouncement that appears to matter much more. And the pronouncement then sits in thin air. It's not grounded in any kind of strategy. It's not grounded in a process of thinking about where you want to be and how you want to get there and how you have to build relationships in order to maximize your chances of achieving your results. And so what happens is you have these tweets, very often involving insults and other quite outrageous assertions, and then there's backtracking. And so the tweets effectively may have gotten some attention on the day that they were issued, but you end up not seeing anything emerge from them. If we were not talking about the President of the United States, we would probably ignore the propensity to use Twitter in this manner. But we are talking about the President of my country and the leader of a country which is still probably the most significant power in the world, both militarily and economically. That's being challenged today, but I think today I can say that with some degree of confidence. And thus the tweets and retreats are not only idiosyncratic behaviors of this man, but they affect critical issues of our national security and impact the security not just of the United States, but also of our neighbors and much of the world. A journalist that I admire greatly, David Ignatius of the Washington Post, recently said that Trump's approach to foreign policy is actually more rational than it appears. In other words, he took issue with what I would call the tweet and retreat. David said that the bluster and the threats and the conscious raising of tensions is designed to throw adversaries off balance and even to throw allies off balance. Adversaries, of course, in order to promote some end that Trump seeks, and in the case of allies, to effect change in existing processes. NAFTA being an example that's close to everyone's attention here in Canada. According to Ignatius, underlying Trump's tweets, whether it be Little Rocket Man or harping on whatever preceded him or whatever was done by Barack Obama as the worst deal ever made, is, in this view, a coercive strategy, a strategy for changing existing policy or relationships. So in this respect, according to that theory of Trump's foreign policy, you take North Korea as an example, and there's some signs of possible progress, which might not have been possible had Trump not gotten Kim Jong-un's attention. Now, the North Korea experts here and in the States might argue differently, that in fact Kim Jong-un had signaled for quite some time before Trump came to office that North Korea had reached a point in the development of its nuclear program and its missile program that it was ready to then engage with the world in order to build North Korea's economy. And it happened that this evolving attitude on the part of the North Korean leader came to fruition, as it were, after Trump came to office. And therefore, Trump is able to claim some credit for what still appears to be the possibility, I underline that word, of a breakthrough in the denuclearization of North Korea. Now, to be sure, Ignatius did not overgeneralize in that assessment, because he admitted that there is much to be concerned about an approach that starts out as destructive but has no apparent upside, at least at the beginning, and therefore continues to be problematic until a possible breakthrough occurs. This would apply most particularly to the Iran nuclear agreement, about which I'll talk more a little bit later, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It applies to the Paris Climate Accord, from which the United States withdrew, and it applies to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's an example that even Ignatius admitted proved the foolishness of this approach of using the tweets and the rants to try to coerce the other side into doing what you want them to do. Because after all, if I digress to China for one moment, and I am not a China specialist, so if there are in the audience, correct me later, there is good reason to take China to task for decades of intellectual property theft and for malign trading policies. There's good reason to do that. And it may not be a bad idea to raise tensions in our trading relationship in order to get China's attention. But if you want to do that, and I know there are so many former diplomats and ambassadors in the audience, and you will know clearly what I'm about to say. If you want to do that, you precede the coercive policy with an approach that builds up the alliances and the relationships and the multilateral aspects of the policy so that you can confront China with a block of trading partners that want to see change. And that possibility existed. Barack Obama and, what was it, 11 or 12 other Pacific trading nations developed this idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership, designed initially as a trade pact, but we all knew that it held within it the possibility of developing in a manner that the North Atlantic relationship has developed in the last 70 years. In other words, going beyond simple trade to broadening other economic relations, political relations, military and security relations. And the value of that, both in real time but also in terms of its possible future, was recognized by China. which fought like hell against the TPP. And what does Trump do when he comes into office? Pulls the United States out of the TPP and then goes after China. It's backwards. What you wanted to do was strengthen the TPP in order to then confront China and say, we want to negotiate change. We want to see the protection of intellectual property and other problems that are happening. The issue then needs, I think, to be tested in some other venues. And I chose today, largely because I've spent most of my career, as did Michael, looking at, analyzing, and developing policy in the Middle East. I wanted to test this against two issues, of whether or not the approach of tweet and retreat, of using kind of coercive language to open up the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough, can actually work. The bottom line, just for those of you who start to daydream, is that it doesn't. And I'll explain why I think that's the case. Let me step back for a minute, though, and ask a large question. And, you know, we put a map up there of the Middle East because we couldn't think of any other map to put up. But it actually makes sense, because I want to ask the question of whether or not there is a grand strategy available to the United States, to Canada, and to others in the Middle East, or whether or not the Middle East, in fact, maybe doesn't matter as much to the United States, Canada, and others. There are many in the United States over the past decade in particular who have assessed the Middle East as being of less importance. Remember, during the Obama administration, there was this idea of the so-called pivot to Asia. But the skeptics about the importance of the Middle East could never really answer the question of why the traditional interests that brought us originally to the Middle East have changed, and in fact, in most cases, have not really changed. Location, location, location. The Middle East sits at the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And not only sits at that crossroads, but also serves as a critical transit point, both for the movement of people that's happening in greater numbers today, but also the movement of strategic assets. And it's a place, therefore, that can be used, for example, by the United States in our effort to deal with challenges to our security in Afghanistan and Iraq, whether or not you agree with what we're doing, but if you are the military planners, having access to the Suez Canal and to refueling facilities and other kind of facilities in a place like Egypt becomes critically important, not just for the proactive side of your policy, but also what's called strategic denial, because you have a place that your potential enemies can't operate there. Second, of course, is energy resources. Yes, the Middle East is diminishing in some respects with respect to fossil fuels and their place in the global market, but it's still pretty significant. About 54% of the world's proven oil reserves are in the Middle East. About 40% of the world's proven natural gas reserves are in the Middle East. 80% of that 40% of natural gas is in two countries, Iran and Qatar. So fossil fuels, even though perhaps the overall impact of the Middle East on the world's fossil fuel requirement is diminishing, it is still extremely significant. And therefore, the security of exports of fossil fuels remains a significant priority. The plethora of problems which beset the Middle East and which always threaten spillover. Terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, religious strife, religious intolerance, economic and social problems. If there was a magical way to ensure that these problems stayed only in the country where they originated, well, you might be able then to ignore what's happening in that country. but they don't stay in a single place. And particularly in a region which is suffering from, I guess we're calling it ungoverned spaces and porous borders, this probability is not a possibility, but a probability of spillover is extremely high. And it remains high because the region itself has proved to be incapable of dealing with its problems. Many of you know, back in 2002, the United Nations Development Program asked a significant number of Arab intellectuals and public policy figures to dissect their own problems and to diagnose their own problems and develop some solutions. It became known as the Arab Human Development Report. And I think there have been 5 of them since 2002. And the analysts from the Arab world, it was not a Western product, basically talked about 3 deficits. A deficit of freedom. They said, how are we going to advance our societies when we don't have the basic freedoms of speech, association, press, political participation, and so forth? A deficit of knowledge. Not that they were saying Middle Eastern population is less smart than anybody else, but that the education system was horrendous. And they weren't training the next generation of Middle Eastern children and students to think creatively and to think independently. And the third deficit was the deficit of women's empowerment, where it is spelled out in the Arab Human Development Report, how do you expect a society to advance when 50% of the members of that society can't participate fully in the economic and other activities of the society? So this was not a Western construct imposed on the Arab and Muslim world. This was Middle Easterners talking about themselves, looking in the mirror. And in a succession of reports over the next decade, no progress was registered on any of those deficits. So it's not just that the region remains important for the traditional reasons, but it also remains important because it's not getting better, and therefore it's only going to get worse as population increases, access to jobs becomes harder, food security becomes an increasing challenge, and so forth. Now, these issues themselves, which should motivate the United States and others to consider the Middle East to remain as an important strategic issue, are exacerbated by a number of significant tensions that are also not getting better. And they're all familiar to you. Sunni-Shia tensions, Sunni-Sunni tensions, Iranian-Saudi tensions and proxy wars, Arab authoritarians, militant Islamists, weak republics, Palestinian-Israeli tensions that I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, identity politics, the rise of tribal politics in so many places. As I mentioned, porous, non-existing borders, ungoverned spaces, militant non-state actors. I usually like to remind people on this question of non-state actors in the Palestinian or Arab-Israeli context. Since 1973, there has not been a war between Israel and the Arabs that is primarily an Israeli-Arab state war. Every war Israel has fought since the October 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, has started as a war between Israel and a non-state actor. The PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, a few times. Sometimes Arab states have been drawn into the war, such as in '82 when Syria came to the help of the PLO at that time. But it tells you that the rise of non-state actors is no longer a sideshow or of peripheral significance. And the rise of non-state actors who are bound by no rules and feel themselves free of all of the other diplomatic courtesies and interactions that even states that are adversaries still basically adhere to, has changed the rules of the larger game. Against this backdrop, then, of enduring interests and these particular challenges, what's been interesting about American policy is the degree to which some of it has been enduring, almost unchanged, and some of it has been so off-key as to suggest that those involved in the policy change have not understood what they've inherited and not understood where they want to go with the policy. A couple of snapshots, the Middle East peace process. You look back at presentations by presidents or secretaries of state over the last, not just 25 years since Oslo and Madrid, but even before that. And a lot of the rhetoric is the same. You know, we want to ensure the security of our friend Israel and its prosperity. We want to ensure good relations with Arab states. We want to be involved in the security of the region so as to prevent aggression from external sources or internal destabilization. So the reasoning has been consistent, remarkably consistent, but the application of policy has been anything but consistent. As I mentioned, and as you heard from Mike in the introduction, I first came to know Michael Bell in the multilaterals that evolved from the Madrid Peace Conference. I've always told people that being involved in that process, being part of Secretary of State James Baker's shuttle diplomacy that preceded Madrid, was one of the most exciting and intense learning periods of my career. But in some ways, I also regret it, because no one has matched that excitement or the degree of acumen and strategic thinking that the Bush-Baker administration showed in bringing about Madrid. Yes, Bill Clinton, towards the end of his presidency, became somewhat manic about the Middle East peace process, but it was very late. And then you start to calculate the number of tactical mistakes that were made at the end of the administration as a result of Camp David calling out the Palestinians or calling out Arafat, when in fact Camp David hadn't really failed, it hadn't succeeded, but you were placing all the blame on one party, making it very difficult for that party to deal with its politics, waiting until after Clinton left office to put forward rather important parameters that could have been used even 6 months before the end of the administration to try to narrow the gaps between the parties. A number of really, I'd call them almost silly tactical mistakes. So on one hand, you have this consistency. Every administration wants to make progress in the peace process. But it's almost like, if you remember, for those of you who remember Monty Python, the 100-meter dash for runners with no sense of direction. You know, they line up, and the starter fires off the gun, and then they all run in different directions. And in some ways, that's been the problem of American policy with respect to the peace process. Iran. Since 1979, the United States and Iran have been at loggerheads. And both sides have good reasons to be very wary of each other and actually to be adversaries. Iranians remember the U.S. involvement in the 1953 coup that ousted the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh. They remember the United States' role in strengthening the Shah by creating a very authoritarian and autocratic security regime. Of course, we, the United States, remember the hostage crisis and the horrible language coming out of Iranian leaders. Not just, you know, the little Satan Israel and the big Satan the United States, but Holocaust denials and calling Israel's very existence into question. So there's good reason for the animosity and the adversarial relationship. But what choices do you then make to try to change that adversarial relationship? Well, one choice is you can go to war, and nobody really wants to do that. Nobody. even those who sound like the warmongers, don't have a clue about how you would start a war with Iran and end it any more successfully than we've ended the war in Afghanistan, what's it now, 17 years later. And all of the casualties, not just to American forces or to Afghan forces, but to the international community that's been trying to help. You could try dual containment, Clinton's policies in the 1990s. But dual containment sacrificed what could have been called offshore balancing, a theory which suggests that in a situation where you don't particularly like either side in a dispute, and we didn't particularly like Iran or Iraq, you play them off against each other. You're smart enough diplomatically to do that. Dual containment means that you've taken on responsibility to actually react adversely to their policies. And that doesn't work. Or the debate about the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. George W. Bush became president in 2001, and there were, I don't know the number, a few hundred centrifuges spinning in Iran. He eschewed diplomacy for threats and unilateral sanctions and left office, and there were thousands of centrifuges. Obama enters office, now facing a much more dire threat, engages in diplomacy, which in its initial iteration fails and allows the United States to work with others in the Security Council to transform unilateral sanctions into multilateral sanctions. And a couple of years later, Iran comes to the negotiating table in an agreement which I will argue, and if anybody takes issue, I'd be happy to discuss it. An agreement that indicated that the P5+1 out-negotiated the Iranians. First of all, it stopped their program in its tracks. Second, it got a commitment from the Iranians never to produce a nuclear weapon, ever. There was no sunset clause on the commitment. Number three, it allowed for very intrusive and extensive verification inspections. And number four, it did not provide the Iranians with the sanctions relief that they thought they were going to get because they weren't very good negotiating the agreement. They left a major hole in the agreement which allowed the United States to maintain some aspects of our unilateral sanctions that included on the banking and financial transactions. Now, you can say that's good or bad, but the fact of the matter is it was a great agreement from the perspective of the P5+1. Not for eternity. But if you wanted to fix the holes in that agreement, or if you wanted to deal with what wasn't covered, such as missile development, regional ambitions, aggressions, and so forth, you had 10 to 15 years to work on it. And of course, we pulled out, which gives Iran the kind of leverage with the rest of the P5+1 that it's now playing to its advantage. Let me look then at two particular issues to take this from the macro level to the micro level. One is an issue that I've been working on I'm only 29 years old, but I've been working on the issue for 45 years. So just, you do the math. And it's an issue where I have to tell you, I go to sleep at night terribly pessimistic, and I wake up in the morning thinking that we can do it, and that's the Middle East peace process. This is a doable, achievable proposition to make peace between Palestinians and Israelis. At the beginning, it's not going to be, I was going to say peace between U.S. and Canada, but might have to revise that in the current administration. It won't be U.S.-Canada for quite some time. There will be walls, and there will be security arrangements, and there will be restrictions on sovereignty, and there will be a lot of a long period in which trust building will become very important. But it's a doable proposition. The problem in this case of tweet and retreat in this administration is the oversimplification of the problem in the mind not only of Donald Trump, but of the three, I guess you're going to put this on the website somebody's going to see it, the three know-nothings whom he appointed to run the policy. His son-in-law, the lawyer for the Trump organization, and his bankruptcy lawyer. Bankruptcy lawyer has had a lot of experience given Donald Trump's bankruptcies. Trump has misunderstood not just the peace process, but has misunderstood the region. Putting U.S. hope in the hands of an authoritarian regime in Saudi Arabia and believing that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, can not only deliver on the Saudi 2030 plan for internal reform, but can also extricate himself from the mess that he's created in Yemen and in Lebanon with what appeared to be the incarceration of the prime minister, the dispute with Qatar, to assume that this man can then, quote unquote, deliver the Palestinians is, I believe, a very faulty misreading of the Saudis. The belief that Israel's security concept, as defined by Netanyahu, can lead to peace. Now, what's interesting about Israel, and I know some of you have served there and you know the environment quite well, is look at the people who are arguing for peace. They are former directors of the Shin Bet, of the Internal Security Service. If you haven't seen the video, The Gatekeepers, I think there are 5 or 6 former directors of the Shin Bet Security Service. All but one basically say, look, I did what I was asked to do, and that was to provide Israel with security. But I'm telling you the policy is wrong because we have to make peace. Look at the several hundred former generals who were part of commanders for Israel's security. And we're not just talking generals, we're talking those who served as the head of Central Command, in other words, in charge of the West Bank, Southern Command, those in charge of Gaza, Northern Command in charge of Lebanon. Those who have given 30 and 40 years of service to protect the security of their country and now are saying the only real security is, A, we, Israel, remain strong, but B, we develop a partnership with our neighbor in Palestine and help them develop a serious state that will take responsibility for its own borders and take responsibility for its own security, which will then help us. And the example they cite is Jordan. Jordan does not provide security for Israel. Jordan provides security for Jordan. But by providing security for Jordan, Israel's security is enhanced. So the people arguing for change in the peace process are the security folks in Israel. The Council on Peace and Security, another group of former generals and senior police officers. A study was published about a year ago by the Center for New American Security, New American Strategy, CNAS. A very intensive study of what it would take to replicate in a peace settlement what Israel believes it enjoys by way of security in the current situation. And the reality is that in some respects, the current situation from a security perspective is very comfortable for Israel. They control the area. They sit on the the mountaintops. They control access, movement of people and goods. They control access in and out of the territories. So thinking about an alternative to that is not a simple matter. And yet, this is a very intensive and extensive study that basically said, if you have layering of technology, international observers, international forces, some unilateral issues where Palestinian rights to security are derogated, are diminished, you can replicate what Israel enjoys by occupying the territory after Israel would give up the territory. This study was actually drawn from a classified study that was undertaken by first General James Jones, the former Marine Commandant, and then General John Allen, who was the head of our Middle East forces, for the Bush and Obama administrations. We don't know what's in the classified study, but Allen became part of the CNAS publication, which means that he brought as much as he could from the classified study into the unclassified version. And what Allen will tell you, he's now the head of the Brookings Institution, what John Allen will tell you is that the Israeli army was not uncomfortable with this, but they weren't allowed to engage because the political echelon simply didn't want to hear what the experts were saying in terms of security. So the test case for Trump in misunderstanding the Middle East becomes quite important. Because if your analysis is wrong, and if your analysis is based on faulty assumptions about the way your partners will act on the basis of what you do, if that's wrong, the chances of your policy coming out right are pretty much diminished. Now, many of us would have suggested to Trump, had he asked on the day after he was elected president. You remember in the Wall Street Journal, he said that he wanted to do the ultimate deal, quote unquote, the ultimate deal between Israelis and Palestinians, and that only he could do it, given his expertise in deal making. Now, those of us, had we been asked, would have said to him, don't make that promise because the time isn't really ripe. And you don't want to overcommit, test the waters. And if you really think you can make a deal and you understand what needs to be done, then give it a shot. But he committed, all right? You commit, you got to do smart policy. Now, where has that smart policy led Trump? The expression, you shoot yourself in the foot. He doesn't have enough feet to account for how many shots he's taken. You take the Jerusalem question. Israel's capital is in Jerusalem. It's just a reality. And every American president for a long time, and I gather some Canadian prime ministers have also suggested that that should be recognized. I'm not mentioning any Canadian names. It's not for me to say. And that's fine because it's real, it's true. But the Palestinians also claim a capital in Jerusalem. And so how much smarter would it have been from a policy standpoint for Trump to have said, we recognize that Israel's capital is in Jerusalem, and accordingly, we are transferring the American embassy to West Jerusalem, and we recognize that Israel's capital is in Jerusalem. We also recognize that Palestinians assert that their capital will be in Jerusalem, and therefore the United States is making an unbreakable commitment to establish an American embassy in East Jerusalem as soon as the Palestinian state is established. How hard would it have been to say that? Because the reality is, if you're going to get to an agreement, that's what's going to happen. There will be an American embassy in East Jerusalem. And if you think that there won't be an American embassy in East Jerusalem, then you're basically saying there's not going to be an agreement. Because Palestinians will not agree to have their capital in Abu Dis or some suburb of the Jerusalem area. So instead of doing what would have been, in my view, smart policy, the president says, I've taken the issue off the table. The Palestinians basically have to suck it up. Number two, an American ambassador in Israel, advocates publicly that we don't call it the occupation anymore. Well, what is it? The United Nations calls it the occupation. Every country in the world calls it the occupation. It's not a dirty word. Occupation is a legal status under international law. And until there's a resolution of this conflict, Israel is an occupying authority with responsibilities under international conventions. Our ambassador doesn't want to call it occupation anymore. This is an ambassador, as you know, who spent his prior life as a bankruptcy lawyer as the chairman of an American NGO that was funding settlements. So is he acting in his capacity as an ambassador, or is he acting in his capacity as a pro-settlements activist? The United States recognizes the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So what do? We cut off funding to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, and we now cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority. The next shoe to drop will be to formally de-recognize Palestinian refugee status, and who knows what follows that in terms of supporting Israeli annexation of parts of Area C and so forth. In other words, step after step by the administration has been very comfortable for the state of Israel. And it's been absurd in terms of trying to achieve an ultimate deal. Because if you're a third party and you want to help achieve an ultimate deal, the deal's going to be between party one and party two. And we're only working with party one. Party two isn't even talking to us anymore. And the administration is proceeding on this illusion that it's going to put forward an extensive plan that everybody's going to find a little bit okay and a little bit not okay, and things will proceed. It's not going to happen at all. And that's not a viewpoint. That is hard analysis of reality. Does it lead anywhere? Well, what's being played out on the ground now? First of all, there's an expectation on the part of the administration that others are going to pick up the slack to deal with the humanitarian distress in Gaza. And much of the international community has done so, helping to fund UNRWA shortfalls and so forth. But how long can that really take place? And what does that do to the pretense of American leadership when we're not even ready to ante up as part of the process of resolving the issue? And as I mentioned earlier, if there is an expectation that once this plan comes out, the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians will embrace it and put pressure on the Palestinians to accept it, the Saudis, Egyptians, Jordanians have told us they're not going to do it. And they're certainly not going to do it unless there's a change on the Jerusalem issue. Iran, similar short-sightedness. I ask myself, in what universe it has made sense to ditch an agreement that at least bought us the 10 to 15 years without having something ready or in the making that would keep Iran's feet to the fire, that would ensure that Iran maintained its obligations. Because every serious analyst, both in the International Atomic Energy Agency and others who are familiar with inspections and verification of nuclear sites, will tell you that Iran has fulfilled its commitments under the JCPOA since it was signed or initialed, what's it now, 3 years ago. Now, everyone will also tell you that it is not a perfect agreement. It's not perfect either intrinsically, because it does have sunset clauses that would presumably come to an end in 10 to 15 years. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't cover some of Iran's malign activities in the region. Okay, you're the president of the United States. Don't throw the agreement out. Pull together as a convener the P5+1 and work to fix it. And on the eve of the United States withdrawal from the JCPOA, we were doing that. We actually were talking to the P5+1. But the president, because Twitter is an immediate gratification issue, said he wasn't going to give it any more time, and he pulled us out. And the talks over amending the agreement over the course of the next 7 to 12 years came to an end, leaving Iran in what I would call the driver's seat. For those who, as I do, teach coercive diplomacy, there's really nothing wrong with it. It is a viable form of diplomacy. But what people forget about coercive diplomacy is that there is also the need for incentives to be built in. The coerced party has to know that if it responds to the coercion, that there's going to be some benefit from it. This year, my graduate students and I are studying Libya, and one of the issues that is occupying us is the fact that coercive diplomacy worked. In 2003, remember, Gaddafi gave up his program of weapons of mass destruction. But the benefits that were promised never quite kicked in the way that Gaddafi understood them. And so there was this period of mushiness between 2003 until the tensions within Libya built up and the Libyan uprising began in 2011. I wish I would be able to conclude on an upbeat note. If I was delivering this at 9 in the morning, I'd be very upbeat, because as I mentioned earlier, I go to sleep pessimistic, but I wake up optimistic. I can't be optimistic, frankly, as long as the President of the United States remains in office, because unless the learning curve changes dramatically, and unless he brings in people who are interested in history, unlike the three who are running this diplomacy, who have said publicly that they're not interested in learning what happened before them. If he brings in people who think this is more than a real estate deal, which the president himself said it is, I'm not sure we're going to go very far on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And until the president begins to understand the strength of multilateral diplomacy, the benefits that the JCPOA did bring, even with their faults, we don't have an answer to the question of where to go next with Iran. So I leave you on a relatively pessimistic note. I'd be happy to take your questions and comments and try to respond to them. But I do want to say in closing, the way I started, that it really is an honor to be here to honor the memory of Michael Bell and to join you in recognizing the man who I think accurately was the face of Canadian diplomacy in the Middle East. Thank you so much.
There's a microphone here, so people are welcome to line up and ask their questions. And as I always tell my students, question is a short statement with a question mark at the end. Please be a good student and introduce yourselves when you ask your questions. So the floor is open for discussion, please.
Ferit Kerkhoff, teaching the history of the Arab world and former ambassador to Cairo. I feel like Leonard Cohen, Do You Want It Darker? Is the disappearance of Nikki Haley making things even worse, because she was still, despite her support for the president on an interim basis, a certain voice of balance. And thank you, fabulous presentation.
Thank you. Look, I think the Nikki, I don't know, but I think the Nikki Haley resignation is strictly a matter of internal politics. She, in fact, contributed to some of the worst aspects of Trump's policies on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. She was a very vocal opponent of Palestinians, called them out at every turn, was an advocate for cutting the aid and cutting UNRWA's aid and so forth. So in that respect, you know, things can get worse. I mean, you know, we have John Bolton, the National Security Advisor.
That's what I meant.
So it could get worse, but I don't think when the story comes out, as it will, of why she has left now, I don't think it was policy differences. I think it's all politics. Is she going to run for president? Is she running for vice president next time around, or something else? And that's my guess at this point.
Okay. Thanks. My name is Rebecca Sears. I'm with an NGO called Mennonite Central Committee. I guess thanks again for your presentation, for coming up, and you're sharing your candid thoughts. My question would be, thinking of in the legacy of Michael Bell and the voice of Canadian diplomacy in the Middle East, what is a middle power like Canada to do in this time of uncertainty with, like, because often we are following the US in terms of our policy, especially in areas like the Middle East. We also have a strong agreement with Saudi Arabia, arms deals, and things like that. I'm just wondering what advice do you have for Canadian policymakers and those speaking to Canadian policymakers?
Look, there's a vacuum now in leadership of what used to be called the liberal world, or the free world, or the West, whatever you want to call it. And the question is whether or not one country can fill that vacuum, which I think is not the case, or whether or not a coalition of like-minded countries can do so. It's hard to imagine right now such a coalition, because even, for example, Europe is divided, increasingly divided. But a country like Canada, and I do not come here to offer advice, but I'll give advice anyway, you know, because I'm leaving tomorrow, so if you allow me. A country like Canada has an extremely strong reputation in favor of multilateralism, in favor of human rights, in favor of what it does on the ground in terms of refugees and displaced persons. And so that kind of moral leadership counts. It counts a great deal in building the coalitions of like-minded countries. It applies a little bit more to the Israeli-Palestinian issue than the Iran issue, because the Iran issue already has this group of P5+1, and we have to see how that plays out over the next period. But in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there is room to work to ensure that the two-state solution doesn't go away. That includes bilateral relations with Israel. It includes encouraging the Palestinians to develop proactive ideas. You know, Palestinians have not had a strong diplomatic strategy ever, and Canada can help, given the fact that Palestinians, I think, have a very high regard for Canadian diplomats and diplomacy, helping them think through how to operate effectively in this environment. Give you one example of how not to operate effectively. You know, the Jerusalem decision happened, and the first thing President Abbas did was to give a god-awful speech at the Palestine National Council. So anybody who wanted to argue, I'm talking about in the United States now, anybody who wanted to argue against the Jerusalem issue had his or her legs cut out from under them, because you ended up not being able to defend this awful speech that Abbas gave. So they need help thinking through how do you develop and move forward on a diplomatic strategy that, in a sense, forces Israel's hand and creates a constituency within Israel that sees that there is a potential partner for peace. Even if it doesn't happen immediately, the so-called peace community in Israel doesn't have a good answer to the question of whether there's a partner, because people look at the speech and they look at the, you know, the daily terrorism and so forth. A good diplomatic strategy may be the equivalent of we would call a rose garden speech, a presidential speech that is truly statesmanlike. Would be important, and that would be something that I think quietly Canadian diplomats and leaders can help the Palestinians think through.
Thanks.
My name is Daniel Bentley. I have no special status other than being retired.
It's a wonderful status.
It is. It is. It allows me to wear suspenders in public. I'm trying to ask what I hope are two related questions. At a number of points, you have alluded to things like failures at the political echelon, and also the various things that explode, that blow up. I mean that figuratively, the role of irrationality and hatreds and so on. And yet the model you present, which is perhaps my background psychology, not diplomacy, essentially looks like a rational model based on the balance of interests and incentives and so on. So my question is, bearing in mind just how dreadfully irrational the Middle East is, and may I be allowed just to say, I remember a photograph I took in a square in the Old City in Jerusalem, and I lived there for 6 years, not in the Old City, in another area. And it suddenly hit me that every single person I could see, based on the costume and one thing and another, hated every single other person that I could see in the picture. With that as a kind of figure, what do you propose for the management of these forces? Bearing in mind also, and here's the link, not just from a transnational, a global perspective, but from the perspective, and I'm looking at the map now, of the main actors, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the peoples of these places, who have their fears and their interests and so on. If you were their leaders, how would you manage, how would you try and reap some benefit from the present chaos? Thank
You know, when I was the U.S. ambassador in Egypt, we had a small fund to bring over American speakers on a variety of topics, and I did not want to use it to talk about policy issues. You know, you could read the New York Times op-ed page and the Washington Post. One of the speakers that I did bring over was a retired professor, Charles Hamilton, who had marched with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. Now, why did I do that? Because Charles Hamilton's experience had taught him that you don't embark on a process of trying to change people's attitudes. You embark on a process to change the laws. The laws govern behaviors, and over time, the behaviors as they change could lead, not necessarily, but could lead to changing in attitudes. Why do I start with this? I don't think governments are qualified to address the issue of dealing with irrationality. Governments have to operate rationally, but they can operate multidimensionally. So as you are working on a rational peace process, or working on a rational diplomatic strategy to deal with nuclear proliferation, or on a rational strategy to do anything else, you also have coercive capabilities. You know, the international coalition to push back or defeat ISIS, Daesh, in that ungoverned space in Syria and Iraq has been pretty successful. It will be truly successful if the whole strategy gets played out. Read what John Allen, that same John Allen I mentioned, he was the commander of the international coalition. Read his congressional testimony where he listed as essential components of the strategy, not just the special forces of the United States and other countries, not just the drones, and not just the heavy military equipment, but the economic issues that need to be resolved, the human problems that needed to be resolved, the creation of safe spaces for people to be able to conduct their lives. So you as a government, as governments, we have the capability of operating in these various dimensions. Not one of them deals directly with what I would call the attitudinal question, what you call the irrationality question. But at the end of the day, I think if you can occupy as much of the rational space as possible, you're going to be ahead of the game with respect to the irrationals. Look, you go back, I remember vividly in the 1990s, we did not make a lot of progress in the Middle East peace process when we were shepherding that process after Madrid. We really didn't. There were some advances. But we gained tremendous amount of momentum for our overall regional policy because leaders in the region were able to say to themselves and their populations, the U.S. is trying hard. It's not succeeding. This is a hard issue to deal with. When we weren't trying hard, then the mistakes became magnified and we lost support from the region. So dealing with irrationality, I leave that to psychologists. Filling in the rational space with smart policies, things that we can do, and that involves the whole range of soft power, the political, economic, social, humanitarian issues, and the full range of hard power of what you sometimes have to do to protect your security.
So, you just said something which sparked my optimism.
Ooh, mark this down.
Because I've witnessed it. My wife and I were actually in Jerusalem in May. My parents had a timeshare there and one thing and another. And we noticed something we've observed before in a number of places, that wherever there are civil public spaces have been created, you see that people come together, and we witnessed this, both Israelis and Palestinians, and they behave normally in ways that are no different than you would see in a public space, say here in Canada.
Read the Israeli press about the incident in which 2 Israelis were killed in this Barkan industrial zone.
Yes.
And what's interesting about it, 2 Israelis were killed. It's a terrorist attack. But everybody is saying that this was a place where Palestinians and Israelis worked together.
Right.
And Palestinians are as upset about what happened as, of course, the Israelis are. Not because Palestinians love the Israelis, but it was a place, it was space. Right. And it was a reasonably safe space, which was then violated by the terrorists.
Right. May I also allude to
Well,
a
I think
mixture of
maybe
cultures?
the
But I guess I
gentleman
will shut
behind
up.
you, yeah. It was a good try, though.
I'm Mark Bailey, a retired Canadian diplomat that spent quite a bit of my career dealing with the issues of the region, and notably in Syria as well as Morocco. And I also was posted in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Governor Bowie, I once heard say that he knew an analysis was correct because he agreed with it.
Just reach into the mic, speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. I heard our former governor of the Bank of Canada say he knew an analysis was correct because he agreed with it. That's how I know your analysis was correct, because I agreed with it. And so I'd be really, really interested to hear your analysis about a country you didn't talk, I don't think you talked about at all, and that's Russia, and what they're up to in Syria, other parts of the region, their relations with Israel, and then bring it back a little bit to what we all think we suspect about the president and his relations with the Russian president and Russia.
You know, to do
Thank you.
justice to the question, you're going to have to invite me back, because it's a very, very broad and deep question. Let me just touch on one or two or three significant points. Number one, I would not advise looking at Russian actions today in a vacuum, but rather in the context of all of our policies vis-a-vis Russia after the end of the Cold War. And I'm thinking particularly of the speed with which NATO and a little bit less so the EU expanded eastward, creating, I think, a situation which was potentially very threatening to a country that we know has a long history of believing that it's being encircled and that it's only a matter of time until the whites come after the reds and undo the government. And so along comes Vladimir Putin in his first term, exploits some of the dissatisfaction of the fact that economics were not working the way everybody thought, the democratic experiment wasn't working the way everybody thought, NATO is expanding eastward, and he's able to use the demagogic platform to build up this idea of having to protect Russian interests, including Russian populations in whether Georgia or, more recently Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet orbit. I would, if I did come back and think about this more broadly, I would probably start there. I mean, you could start back in Tsarist Russia as well, but I'd probably start in the 90s because I think that accounts for a significant degree of, I said I'm not a psychologist, but I think it accounts for a significant degree of the psychology behind Putin's thinking, number one. Number two, if you look at where Putin has been most assertive in the extension of Russian power, it's very traditional places. Crimea, what he argues, we gave it to the Ukraine in the 1950s, 53, 54, and it's really ours, so I'm going to take it back. And we have this large Russian-speaking population in the eastern part of the country, and they're concerned because the Ukrainian government is not taking care of their interests. I'm not justifying his view, but he chose Ukraine carefully because there is a long connection. Syria. For many decades, the United States and our allies had been pretty adept at keeping Russia or the Soviet Union out of the Middle East. You can't imagine the degree to which the flip of Egypt in the 1970s was a strategic disaster for the Russians. I don't know if it's a true story. It may be apocryphal, but there is a story that says a Soviet general in 1972, when 17,000 advisors were asked to leave Egypt that summer, the Soviet general was asked, "Do you feel bad about this?" And he said, "Well, of course we feel bad, but we had 17 good years of a relationship." Well, that relationship since 1972 has not existed. It may be coming back a little bit, and they're trying to find points of entry. but they've been shut out of the Gulf. They've been shut out of Egypt, much of the Maghreb. Where did they have a foothold? It was Syria. And the flip side of that is that the United States never saw Syria as a strategic interest. I mean, the argument that's being made since 2011 about U.S. intervention in Syria, whether we should have or shouldn't have, is a humanitarian argument. It's not a strategic argument. So they've been quite careful, at least until now, of choosing the places where they have had, where they can argue that they've had a strategic interest. They may do better for themselves the more the United States fails or withdraws. But for the time being, I would at least start to analyze Russian policy through that prism. And it gets to a third point, and I don't want to expand because I do want to get invited back. It gets to a third point, which is, and someone may challenge me here on this, named John Bell. I think from 2011 until, at least until 2015 and the military intervention by the Russians, I think they were very ready to work with the United States to find something other than the Assad regime. Maybe Assad minus. Maybe Assad with enough checks and balances that it really wouldn't be Assad. I personally think that's the case. You know, the weakness of my argument is that it's based on just a few conversations with Russians. Maybe I talked to the wrong Russians. But I'm not sure that they saw this in 2011 to 15 as a zero-sum game. I think when the prospect of Assad actually losing power and the regime coming crashing down in September of 15 is when their calculation shifted. Certainly the defense ministry's calculation shifted, and they said, all right, you know, we're coming to the rescue. And now they're fully invested in this regime.
Oh, yes, to the hilt.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. Thank you for coming to campus, and thank you also for your service. I'm asking on behalf, and I can't speak for them, but there's some budding diplomats in the audience, and what advice would you give them for their career paths?
Well, become diplomats, first of all. You know, look, there are technical parts of the advice. Study languages, you know, whether it's Arabic, if you want to focus on the Middle East, or Chinese or Russian. Languages are critically important because, you know, it was Dean Rusk who said that the only real tool of a diplomat is his or her ears. And if you're listening to people in their native language, you're going to understand far better. You know, the work of diplomats is not only conducted in the conference room or in the minister's office. It's the dinner parties, and it's the taxi rides, and it's the street talk, and it's getting a feel for the society. And the only way to be able to do that is to be able to understand and interact, you know, sitting in the coffee shop and just chatting with people. So it's a technical issue, but it becomes critically important later on. Second, I teach diplomacy, and what I've tried to do is disaggregate the word diplomacy into its various iterations: traditional, crisis diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, preventative diplomacy, and so forth. And I think, you know, a careful study of the literature, including the old masters, you know, going back a couple hundred years, a lot of it appears out of date and antiquated, but they also have a lot to teach us. Just to give you one example, the warnings that de Callier, I don't remember, was a couple hundred years ago, the warning one of the warnings he issued was against summitry, because his argument was that princes shouldn't talk to each other. They should have their emissaries talk to each other, because when princes talk to each other, there's no recourse other than what they said to each other. And they have now made national policy. If you want to fast forward as an example of that, in 1973, Richard Nixon is suffering from the Watergate issue, and the October War breaks out. And as that war is not coming to an end, he dispatches Henry Kissinger to Moscow. And while Kissinger's in the air, what does Nixon say publicly? He says, I have given Kissinger complete authority to decide what to do. Kissinger subsequently tells people that that's the worst thing that ever happened to him. Because when he's in the room with the Russians in Moscow, and he's talking to them and they're engaging, he wants to be able to say, I have to call the president before I commit to this. If the president has said that he has plenipotentiary authority, the Russians will say to him, you don't have to call anybody, make the decision. So, you read the masters in this case, and it sounds a little bit funny, princes shouldn't engage in summits, but then you see case studies where that kind of activity is not so helpful. So study.
Merci.
Take courses with Peter Jones. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Kazim Rizvi. I'm a second-year student here at Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. My question to you is, can a durable peace be achieved by redrawing the borders in the Middle East by the people instead of outside forces?
I think the simple answer to that is no. Look, not all of the borders in the Middle East are artificial. They're, residual effects of actions by the League of Nations and the mandates and colonial powers. I think an effort to redraw the borders now is a prescription for violence and warfare. Now, if you fast forward the clock 100 years and we've had a period of calm, let's say, for 20 or 25 years, and people say, our border really should be here and your border should be there, well, then you can start talking to people. But I would be very hesitant about arguing for redrawing borders. One of the things that was most interesting when we were trying to come up with creative solutions, we looked at the two places along the US-Canadian border where we have never agreed on where the border is. We have a border dispute. One is in Glacier Waterton National Park. Yeah. You walk into that park from one side, you're coming in from either Canada or the US, but when you walk out the other side, you're in the other country, and we've never agreed on where the line is. And the other place is somewhere east, but I don't quite know where.
Mm.
New Brunswick. Yeah, New Brunswick. So if two of the countries that have enjoyed, with our, disputes over time, we don't like each other on softwood and on salmon, those kind of disputes and others. If we can't agree on borders, what are you going to do with peoples who are undergoing identity crises, where there's sectarian challenges, who are already fighting each other, and you're going to ask them to negotiate new borders? No, I would say no.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, George Jacob. I worked with Michael on Middle East affairs. And in retirement, it's a bit difficult to keep up his legacy in the Twitterverse and the Facebook universe, which I would say is the two-state solution, which he wrote the book on in terms of Canadian policy and is on our website, and his proposals, along with the other Mike, on Jerusalem. Because of outright rejectionism, by the Netanyahu crowd, or indifference by the Palestinians, or lack of hope by anyone else, or complete silence by people who don't want to opine on the subject. So I was a bit happy when the president came down in favor of a two-state solution, albeit somewhat ambiguously.
Kind of, yeah.
And said, in fact, could be based on a real estate deal, which in fact I think is partly right. So I'm wondering whether you think that kind of solution can be pushed in the deal of the century. And on the Jerusalem proposal, if you could entice the president and assure him that he could build a Trump Tower right in Jerusalem if he secured the Michael's legacy on Jerusalem, that might be a sufficient enticement to move him forward.
Well, thank you very much on the second question. I'll let you propose that. Look, if the president truly has begun to understand that the two-state solution is really the only viable one, and it doesn't mean it's the only possibility. There are dozens. I did a whole course on alternative strategies to achieve Palestinian-Israeli peace, and my students in the first day said to me, if you think that we're here to prove the two-state solution is the best, you're wrong. We're going to try to prove that there are alternatives. And I said, that's great. And the last day of class, they said, okay, two-state solution is the only one that's viable. It may not be the best, but it's better than any of the others because it's the one that fulfills the kind of minimal aspirations and requirements of the two sides. So if the president has really come to grips with that fact, then he's got to act accordingly. And the policies have to look at the 5 or 6 core issues: territory and borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, settlements, economic relations, and so forth. And he's got to come out with an American approach, or I would advise him to come out with an American approach that basically says, we know where you've come to in previous negotiations. We have a very good picture of where they've come to, and they've come pretty close. You look at what Olmert and Abbas did in 2008, they were not far apart. And had Olmert not been indicted and ultimately convicted, if he remained prime minister, we might be talking about some other conflict today. So, you take that and you develop an American approach that says, you walk into the negotiating room, we are not going to support your starting from the idea that all of Israel, all of the territories are Israeli, and we're not going to support your approach that all of the territories are Palestinian. You've already narrowed that down to land swaps and, where are they going to be and how do you decide what's equal in value and quality and so forth. So if he's come to that conclusion, let him operate on it, on the basis of it. And on your second point, I think the Jerusalem Old City Initiative really is an ingenious way of approaching the issue, because it basically says this is a problem that's not going to be solved through sovereignty in the first instance, but you can manage this issue once you've resolved the rest of the issues and the two sides understand that they can find a way to live together and deal with jurisdiction and legal issues and to deal with Jerusalem. Yeah, I guess last question?
We have one last question, and then Michael Roy will say a few words.
Hi, I'm Hart Kroll, former diplomat. I think you may have addressed much of what my question poses. There is an old conundrum. Israel has a choice. Has a number of choices to make. One is that it can hold all of the West Bank. The second, it can be democratic. And the third, it can be Jewish. Pick two. Where does Israel stand on that kind of a conundrum?
Look, many of you know it's a divided polity on this question. The country would, I think, largely be united around the idea of doing all three. They want to hold all the territory, and they want to be Jewish, and they want to be democratic, and they can't figure out a way to deal with the internal contradictions that are involved in trying to do all three. When you say, well, to be Jewish and democratic, you've got to give up the territories, you have a strong body of opinion that says this is the homeland, the moledet, and we don't want to give it up. If you say, all right, so let's be democratic and the territory, then you have people say, wait, we're almost 50-50 in number, and that means that at some point it may not be a Jewish state at all, and so forth. And it's a society that's internally very divided on this question. You even look at their electoral results. The last time Netanyahu ran for an election, he basically got lucky at the end in being able to form a government. You remember the last-minute maneuvers where he said the Arabs are coming to the polls and he scared people. That was designed not to gain votes that weren't going to go to the right. It was designed to gain votes for his party on the right so that he would be given a chance to form the first government. And it worked. His party got the right number of seats. He was given the first opportunity. The other parties joined a coalition, and he became the prime minister. But there was no guarantee that in the same results, the opposition could have formed, because it was a 50-50 split. And the country is split 50-50. You've got some extremes on the right and the left, and you have everybody else bunched in the middle along this dividing line, not knowing what to do to resolve the dilemma that you pointed out. Thank you very much.
First and foremost, on behalf of everyone here, I would like to thank Daniel Kurtzer for his brilliant expose and his cogent analysis of the problem that has befuddled us, befuddled me since 1950, when I was 4 years old, and I heard something about Israeli tanks crossing the Jordan River. And I asked my mother, I knew what tanks were, but I had no idea what Israelis were. And it's been, it's been part of all of our consciousness, all of our lives. So it's a real privilege, Dan, to hear your thoughts on this. And we will come up with an excuse before very long to actually have you back here. So may I ask for a hand for Dan? Now, I have one other duty to perform today. Some weeks ago, I received a telephone call from our ambassador in Tel Aviv, Deborah Lyons, who told me that the embassy in Tel Aviv had named its conference room after Michael Bell. And when our friends over at Global Affairs, GAC, Global Affairs, what?
Canada.
Global Affairs Canada, that's what the C stands for. Global Affairs Canada heard this. They created something, and they have deputized me today to present it to you, Linda. So please step forward. And I was going to say it was a big kiss that she sent. No, here. This is a replica of the plaque that is on the door of the conference room in Tel Aviv. The big question is, what do we do for the third one? Stay tuned. I think we'll probably bring together the little committee that met a year ago, early in the new year, and we'll come up with a plan for the next one, and for perhaps to give some thought to some ways to sustain and increase. And I think Terry Ferry is giving me a little sign. I believe I'm going to gazump you, okay, and basically say that it seems that the president of this university has agreed that this university will be the permanent home of the Michael Bell Lectures. Is that correct? Thank you. Thank you, Terry.